Our lecture this evening, which promises to be both stimulating and informative. I'm Richard Daly, Professor of Management Emeritus from the School of Business here on campus. First, I wish to thank President Royce Engstrom for his generous support of this lecture series. His support enables the university to bring a number of distinguished speakers to our campus. Our lecture, Global Natural Resource Markets, Perspectives from Business Strategy, is the Brendan Guth Memorial Lecture, which is conducted in conjunction with the Environmental Studies program. The Brendan Guth Lecture is offered in memory of a former philosophy major, environmentalist, and world-class kayaker who died tragically in an accident on a river in Chile in 2001. Brendan's love of philosophy and of environmental issues inspired many in Missoula to continue his legacy. And in addition to the annual Brendan Guth Lecture, a broad citizen effort, and many of us remember this, in Brendan's memory, led to the construction of Brendan's Wave on the Clark Fork River. And many of us enjoy going down to that overlook on a summer afternoon or evening and watching kayakers navigate their way through Brendan's Wave. The lecture is made possible by a generous donation from Brendan's father, David Guth. Our speaker is Professor Forrest Reinhardt. He is the John D. Black Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. Forrest is a native of Missoula, the son of Howard and Shinwan Reinhardt. And many of us remember Howard as the long-time dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. And Howard is remembered as a dean, not only of intellectual strength, but of a tremendous personal character. A highly regarded dean, and you don't often hear a faculty member say that about a dean. Professor Reinhardt holds a BA, an MBA, and a PhD from Harvard. He is the co-chair of Harvard Business School's Global Energy Seminar. This is a new executive education course for leaders in companies that do work in oil and gas, generate and distribute electricity, or play other significant roles in the delivery of energy services. He also teaches on a regular basis in the business school's agribusiness seminar. In his course on global markets, he draws on macroeconomics, microeconomics, political science, and history. In this way, he is able to help business leaders understand the political and economic environment in which business takes place. In addition, they get an understanding of how strategic opportunities and risks operate in globalization situations. Currently, he is serving as the faculty chair of the Business School's European Research Initiative. In his teaching and research, Professor Reinhardt is interested in the relationship between market and non-market strategy, the relations between government regulation and corporate strategy, and the behavior of private and public organizations that manage natural resources. Professor Reinhart is the author of a book titled Down to Earth: Applying Business Principles to Environmental Management. He has also written a large number of papers that have been published in professional journals that analyze problems of environmental and natural resource management. Please welcome Professor Reinhart.
Thank you, Professor Daly, and thanks to the university for inviting me here, and to the Guth family, and to all of you for coming to spend a beautiful evening in a dark auditorium. I'm really flattered and honored that you would want to spend this time with me. Professor Daly mentioned that I've been teaching a lot in two different executive programs, one for energy executives, another for executives in agriculture. So I thought I might start my remarks this evening by talking first a little bit about energy and then a little bit about agriculture, which seem to me to be two of the most important, most pivotal industries in the world today, despite all the attention that Facebook and video games get. And then if I can then turn my attention a little bit more broadly to questions about sustainable development and what, if anything, that phrase means, I'd like to spend the second half of my remarks on that topic, and then I hope we'll be able to have substantial time for some questions and perhaps even answers. So let me then start by talking a little bit about energy. So this is a topic about which there's a lot of entrenched opinion on either side of many of the issues, right? So I think in the few minutes that I devote to this topic, I'll probably manage to offend most of the people in this room. And then I'll do the same thing for agriculture, and then who knows what will happen when I get to sustainable development. But to start with, why do we think energy is so interesting and important? Well, the answer is that energy is completely pivotal to what we think of as being prosperity, right? So for most of human history, when most people were miserably poor, they had no energy at their disposal except the energy of their own muscles, and maybe a donkey or an ox, and maybe some wood or a small water mill or a small windmill. And it happens to be at the time that we figured out collectively how to exploit the fossil fuel resources of this planet that we started becoming prosperous. And now we are prosperous in large measure because the economic surpluses that have been created by these cheap supplies of energy have enabled us to get rich, to save, to create capital, which has then made us more productive, which then allows us to save more. So the phenomenon that jump-started this was the devotion of fossil fuel resources to the economic problems that the people confronted. And now we are in a situation where there's a widespread concern that we're running out of those fossil fuels, and that our descendants will be doomed to the kind of poverty that our long ago forebears had to undergo. I think that view is wrong, and I'd like to explain over the next few minutes why I think that's wrong. But to start with, you see that I insisted that I have a chalkboard here because as an academic I can't possibly live without my props, right? I want to point out to you something which is implicit in what you know of energy, but which is rarely made explicit, maybe because it's so simple. But there are really at least two energy industries, right? There's an energy industry that starts mostly with oil wells and ends up mostly with personal mobility services, cars, maybe planes, but I can barely draw a car, as you can see, and I'm certainly not going to try to draw a plane. And then, as huge and profitable as that business is, there's another even bigger energy business which starts with gas, nuclear, hydro, solar, wind, etc., and ends up with the provision of heat, light, and power, right? So think about the differing economics and the differing politics of these two value chains, right? Here, as we well know, the price of the crude oil, and hence the price of the gasoline that we use to run our vehicles, has been in general rising over the past 40 years and extremely volatile, right? There have been booms and busts, right? Over here, the extraordinary thing is that during the same 40 years since the first oil shocks, the inflation-adjusted price of electricity in the United States has been almost level. Right? That is, it has not risen and it has not been very volatile. Now, why is that? That's because when the cost of one of these input supplies starts to go up, we do the sensible thing and we switch to other sources of supply. Right? So that when it looked for a while as though nuclear power was going to be cheap, we built a lot of reactors. Then, when we decided collectively that we were going to make nuclear power uneconomical, we turned to gas or to hydro. And so the price of these outputs then has been relatively constant over time because we've allowed ourselves to substitute one of these things for the other. Over here, there hasn't been any such substitution opportunity, which means that occasionally prices spike and people complain that they're too high and congressmen get voted out of office and. Now, interestingly, most of the innovations that people like to talk about when they're talking about energy have the characteristic that they're drop-in substitutes for one of these value chains or the other. So think about ethanol, for example. Right? Ethanol is just a drop-in substitute for gasoline. Right? You burn it in the same engine, it's dispensed with the same equipment. You're just using a corn plant if you're in Iowa or a sugarcane plant if you're in Brazil as a substitute for the crude. Right? And then similarly on the electricity side, the solar and the wind resources that so appeal to the environmental community are basically drop-in substitutes for coal or nuclear or gas. I should have put coal up there, shouldn't I? Now, I want to make 2 points. One is that the really interesting things that are going to happen in the energy sector in the next couple of decades don't have to do with drop-in substitutes for one or the other. The really interesting things have to do with the convergence of these two value chains. Right? That's going to happen in 2 ways. It's going to happen with the electrification of the vehicle fleet, which means that we'll be able to run our cars on coal, gas, nuclear, etc. Or it's going to happen upstream through coal to liquids or gas to liquids technologies. Those technologies are not unproblematic, right? So with the electric vehicles, for example, we need a refueling infrastructure to go along with the vehicles. The companies that are going to build the refueling infrastructure are not the same as the companies who will build the vehicles. And each is waiting for the other to go first. But as long as each is waiting for the other to go first, nobody's going to move. Right? So there's a big coordination problem down here. The problems up here have to do with capital, and they have to do with environmental impact. And it's not clear that coal to liquids or gas to liquids will ever be dominant technologies. But either one of these innovations has the potential to supplant the oil production, which has been the driver of so much corporate profit and so much political dysfunction over the past 50 or 100 years. Right? So these changes are enormously interesting. Right? That's one of the points I wanted to make. The second point I wanted to make is closer to this sort of core business strategy question that was promised in the title to this talk. So when we teach first-year strategy at Harvard Business School to our MBA students, we talk to them about a wedge between willingness to pay and cost. So willingness to pay is just what it sounds like. It's the willingness of the customers to pay for the output of the firm, right? And the cost is the total cost of delivering that product or service, including the cost of the capital, the cost of the inputs, the cost of the know-how, the cost of the management talent, etc. And so this is the economic surplus that is being created in a firm, right? Now, if a firm doesn't create value in that sense, if it can't create a wedge between the willingness to pay and the cost, the only way it can survive is by obtaining value from other entities that do create it, right? And how might it do that? Well, it might use the government, for example, right? So sugar producers in Idaho, for example, don't actually create social value, right? How do they then generate enormous profits? Well, they get the federal government to intervene in global sugar markets, basically imposing a tax on every one of us who consumes sugar in order to move that money to the producers. That's not a value-creating thing. That's a value-destroying thing, in fact. So firms, in general, have to create a gap between willingness to pay and cost. Then they and their customers get to negotiate, to be polite, about the distribution of that economic surplus. Right? And if the producers are powerful and the consumers are weak, then the price might be close to the willingness to pay. If the converse is true, then maybe the consumers will capture most of the value. So who's getting the value from the energy value systems, by and large? It's got to be the producers, right? You look at those profits, they're unbelievable, right? That's completely wrong, right? The fact is we consumers are capturing the vast majority of the economic surplus created in the energy sector. And you can convince yourself of that by thinking about your own willingness to pay for the energy that you've purchased today, right? So, for example, when this lecture concludes, sooner or later, you will all drive home, right? Almost all of you drove. And the amount of money that you will consume in your gas tanks to get home, it depends where you live, right? If you live way down the Bitterroot, you might pay a couple of bucks, right? If you live nearby, you might pay a quarter of a dollar. Think about what your willingness to pay for that energy is. Like, would you rather spend the night in your own bed or here in this beautiful theater, right? And how much would it be worth it to you? An order of magnitude over the price, at least, maybe 2 orders of magnitude over the price. Right? And it's even more pronounced in the electricity sphere, right? When you turned on your computer this morning to check your emails or your, NCAA bracket or whatever it was, what was your willingness to pay for that electricity? Well, without it, your computer is totally useless. This is just a rock, right? You paid so little for your electricity this morning that you don't even know how much you paid for it in all likelihood. But your willingness to pay for it exceeded the amount that you actually paid by a factor of 10 or 100 or 1,000. So the fact is, the price of the energy that we're consuming is down here someplace. Yet even with this relatively slim margin, as you know, companies are getting fantastically wealthy. Vast amounts of money are moving from consuming countries to producing countries. But there's nothing inevitable about the maintenance of this price so close to the cost and so far from the willingness to pay, right? The producers of the energy have to be forgiven for thinking that maybe this value should be a little bit higher, right? It's their job. So that suggests that maybe then, the next few decades in the energy business will be as interesting as the last few decades have been, which is to say more interesting than many of us who aren't in the industry would like them to be, right? Before going on to say just a word about peak oil. So peak oil is a fashionable idea, right? The idea is, there's a finite amount of oil in the Earth's crust, and once we drill it and extract it, it's not there anymore. And so that means that there will come a point at which oil production, annual or daily or whatever, will hit a maximum and then it will fall. And the idea is that once it starts falling, the world will be a very ugly place because there will be increasing competition for these diminishing supplies, and there will be more armed conflict, and there will be more economic dislocation as the price goes up. I don't think that's actually the right way to think about the oil markets. I think the right way to think about the oil markets is that there's a wide variety of hydrocarbon in the Earth's crust. Some of it is extremely easy to extract, extremely easy to transport and refine, and therefore extremely valuable. Right? And as you get further from that ideal, the resources get more and more difficult geologically or maybe politically to extract, and more expensive to refine because they're sulfurous or because they're gunky or something else. But the fact is there are lots of different hydrocarbons, and reserves are not a physical idea. We have this idea that reserves of oil are like a physical quantity, like the amount of liquid in a glass. But that's not true. It's really, reserves are an economic idea, not a physical one, because reserves are the amount of energy that can economically be extracted. So as the price goes up, if the price goes up, more things become reserves that weren't reserves before. And you can see that very clearly in what's happened in the natural gas markets just in the last few years, right? Natural gas prices were going up for a decade or more prior to a few years ago. And because of those price increases, there were enormous incentives for entrepreneurs to figure out ways of extracting gas from places where it couldn't previously be extracted, including from shale formations, right? So now what's happened, these technologies have been deployed on a massive scale. The price of gas has fallen by 70%. I'm talking about natural gas now, you understand, not gasoline. The price of natural gas has fallen by 70%, and we're faced with a glut. And the liquefied natural gas terminals that entrepreneurs were trying to build all over the coast of North America are now thought more likely to be export terminals than import terminals. And that's the way the market is said to be supposed to work, right? You see some scarcity, and the scarcity sends signals both to producers and to consumers, here in this case to producers, and they develop ways of creating more supply that weren't profitable before. So far this seems pretty straightforward, and it seems like energy shouldn't really be too problematic. I think that the difficulties with energy have historically arisen because of two hidden costs of our energy consumption. Economists would call them externalities. That just means costs that are borne by society but are not embedded in the private prices. So one obvious externality associated with energy has to do with the environment, right? So you have, when we burn fossil fuels, either directly in our cars or indirectly when we flip the light switch, we are putting emissions into the air. And the price of the social cost of those emissions is not reflected in the price that we pay at the gas pump or in our electricity bill. What that means, in the crudest possible level, is that we use more energy than we ought to because the price is lower than it ought to be. Right? And you can disagree about how big this externality is. It probably isn't 100% of the private price of gasoline, for example, but it's got to be 10%. And that's one of the externalities. The environmental externality is one externality. A second externality that the government historically has spent as much time worrying about as the environmental externality has to do with national security. Right? So we have this view in the United States that we're importing too much oil from nations who may or may not wish us well. Well, I mean, much of it comes from Canada, so I don't know what your view is about that, but we do have this sort of entrenched view that we're importing too much oil, and as you know, every president since Nixon has given at least one speech in which he said we're importing too much oil from other countries and we've got to bring that number down. And under every president, the fraction of crude oil that comes from non-American sources has gone up. So maybe we don't really believe it, right? But we do spend a lot of money on defense. We spend about $800 billion a year on defense. That's close to $3,000 per man, woman, and child in the country. And much of those resources are directed toward protection of the oil routes. Right? Now you can say, oh, that's fine. We're protecting them not only for ourselves, but also for the Japanese and the Europeans and the Chinese and everybody else. And that's very, I'm sorry. Jeez. That's very magnanimous of us. The fact is we do pay that. And the fact is the cost of that national defense is not embedded in the price that you pay at the gasoline pump. And that too makes us use too much, right? So what this means, what these unregulated externalities mean effectively is that we are subsidizing our consumption of energy. We price it too low, and so we consume too much. And in general, people all over the political spectrum oppose subsidies in general. people tend to like the subsidies that they get themselves. And they tend to think of reasons that they're not really subsidies. But we should be honest with ourselves, right? This is an academic environment. We're supposed to think clearly about these problems, and then we're supposed to figure out what we might do about it. Okay. Let me turn to the one set of human activities that's even more fundamental than energy, if I could. That has to do with food, right? So, the central fact of economic life in the last 200 years has been that Reverend Malthus, who famously predicted catastrophe and famine, was wrong. Here's what Malthus said. Malthus said, food supplies tend to grow arithmetically and populations tend to grow exponentially, and the result will be catastrophe, like famine or war or pestilence or something. And it turns out, he wrote that in about 1800. It turns out in the intervening 200 years, that hasn't been the right way to look at the world, apparently, right? So what's happened instead is that, this is time, right? Here's time, this is a different thing. This is, here's the price of food, right? Adjusted for inflation. The price of food adjusted for inflation since 1800 to the present has been falling. Right? That is, the amount of labor required to earn enough money for the loaf of bread, the daily bread, or the rice bowl has declined more or less continuously over time for the last 200 years. And so it's easy to think, well, of course, that's always going to continue. The fact is, there's nothing inevitable about the continuation of that decline, right? Why has that decline occurred? That decline has occurred because agriculture has become fantastically more productive in the intervening 200 years, right? And will we continue to enjoy those kinds of gains in agricultural productivity? The honest answer is that we don't know, right? But we can look for clues in the recent past, right? One thing we do know is that over the next 40 years, unless there's some true cataclysm, the population of the world is going to go from today's 7 billion to about 9 billion people. We hope, and most people expect, that those people will be increasingly prosperous, which means on average they will want to eat a lot more meat. There are a few vegetarians, but on average, more prosperous people eat more meat. And since it takes several kilograms of grain to make 1 kilogram of beef, pork and chicken are a little bit better, that means that the demand for cereals, for basic cereals, for corn and soy and wheat and rice, is going to increase faster than the population increases. Unless, again, there's a cataclysm and we all become poorer, which we hope won't occur. Right? So the fact is that over the next 40 years, we need basically to double world cereal production, basic grain production, if we don't want this price to turn back and start rising again. And if the price does start rising again, that will be a totally different world than the one we currently inhabit. Right? And it will not be as pleasant a place to live. We got a little glimpse of this in 2008 when there was that big food price spike, and the response of food-producing governments all over the world was to contemplate export controls. Everybody contemplated it. Some people actually did it. The Russians did it. The Argentinians did it. The Americans did not do it. But you can easily imagine that it's hard for a government, democratically elected or not, to allow food exports at a time when its own people are going hungry. Right? And so that is, I think, the most likely candidate for a reversal of the globalization trend that we've seen over the past 60 years since the end of the Second World War. And I know that there's a difference of opinion about globalization, but I think that the specialization and the scale economies that globalization has allowed have been instrumental in the creation of prosperity for literally hundreds of millions, if not billions of people throughout the world, and that a reversal of those trends would be catastrophic. But a reversal of those trends is relatively easy to predict if this food price does start to go back up. So how will we double cereal production? Well, how did we double it last time? Let's think about that. That's a way to sort of make some progress. Well, you've all heard about the Green Revolution, right? Which was responsible for the avoidance of tens, if not hundreds of millions of deaths that would have occurred otherwise. How did that come about? Well, it came about because we were able to extract more agricultural production from every acre of land, right? And at the same time, we started doing more acreage. So, you know, my father's a mathematician, so I hesitate to write math on the board because I'm going to embarrass him. But let's just write a simple equation here. This, even I can do, right? Output equals output per acre times acres, right? Why? Because the acres cancel, right? And you're left with output, okay? So far, so good? That's all right? All right, good. So the Green Revolution was largely about increasing this number, which is called land productivity, right? We did expand the number of acres, but even by the 60s, a lot of the cultivable area was already being cultivated, right? So how did we get output per acre to rise so fast during the Green Revolution? Basically by throwing more of other inputs at each acre of land. And those inputs included water with irrigation, they included fertilizer, which is a very energy intensive thing to produce, as you know. They included pesticides, they included herbicides. Also a big fraction of the Green Revolution, my plant physiologist colleagues at Harvard tell me, had to do with the jiggering of the plant so that more of the photosynthetic process went to the parts that people like to eat, that is the seeds, and less to the stalks. And we're now maxed out at that. We can't do that again. We've also reached the point of diminishing returns on a lot of the other inputs, right? We could double fertilizer per acre if we want to, but it won't do very much good in most of the world, right? In the United States, in Canada, in Europe, and in China, where they already put more nitrogen on each acre than we do here in the United States. The gains from increasing the amount of fertilizer put on each acre are not going to be consequential. The same is true for water in much of the world, although not all of it. The same is true for chemical inputs like herbicides and pesticides. So we're not going to do it. We're not going to get it all just by brute force throwing more other stuff at each acre. Well, maybe we can expand the acres. That'd be good. But where are we going to do that? Well, there's all that rainforest in Brazil that you read about. It's not very good for agriculture, it turns out. It's also valuable for lots of other things. We should hope that the Brazilian government will choose not to convert it to agriculture. And they probably won't, not because they care so much about global public goods, but because it just wouldn't be very good agricultural land. There is a lot of agricultural land in central and southern Brazil, which is not currently being exploited very efficiently. So there's some room there. The main other big area for agricultural expansion is in sub-Saharan Africa. And there, the acreage is being left unexploited because of dysfunctional political institutions that make it very hard for farmers to capture the value that they create through planting and harvest. Africa also turns out to be the place where average land productivity, output per acre, is lowest, largely again because people lack the access to financial capital markets to buy the inputs that would allow them to increase the productivity. So we can do something there. But I think that the big untapped resource for increasing output per acre is in sort of pure technology. That is in creating new strains of the plants that can develop, that can yield the same amount of corn with less of the other inputs. So plants are being developed mostly in the United States. The United States is the leader in this kind of agricultural biotechnology that will generate the same output per acre using less water and less nitrogen fertilizer and maybe less pesticide and less herbicide. These are enormously controversial technologies. There's a lot of concern among farmers that the companies like Monsanto and Pioneer are going to try to capture too much of the value from these technologies, which is to say all of it. And there are widespread views that that these technologies may have consequences that we cannot foresee and therefore must avert by not allowing the technology to be deployed in the first place. This is called the precautionary principle, and it's trotted out not just in the food business but also in the energy business. The problem with the precautionary principle is that it encourages us to think about these decisions piecemeal and to preclude technologies because we can think of some reason to object to them, rather than thinking about the whole and thinking what is the best overall solution, considering the opportunity costs of failing to deploy a particular technology. So we can foreclose this option if we want to. There are lots of politicians in Europe who would love to do that. The question is, then what? Then do we imagine that there's some other way to increase land productivity? Or do we imagine that we're somehow going to expand acreage? Or do we just say it's inevitable that food prices will rise and we just have to bear the consequences? Those all seem like bad choices too. So if we use the precautionary principle as a way of failing to try new things, then we'll be left with old evils. And I think that's true not just in food, but in the energy sphere as well, right? So, for example, we say we shouldn't build nuclear reactors because they're dangerous, because people might get hurt. So if we don't build nuclear reactors, will we decide we're going to use less electricity virtuously? Well, don't bet on it. It hasn't happened so far. Will we decide to build windmills? Well, maybe, but windmills are actually quite capital intensive, and if we're going to build massive wind and solar, we need to solve the storage problem, because the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine at the same time as people want to run their dishwashers. Right? And that turns out to be a very significant problem. That's why so much energy and talent is being invested in trying to come up with better batteries. But we haven't fixed that yet. So in food, if we don't develop these agricultural biotechnologies, then we're going to be left with some familiar but maybe quite unpleasant consequences if in the energy sphere we take particular technologies off the table, like nuclear, for example, then we'll be left with the evils of the technologies that we know. When we burn coal, we know that we kill miners every year with probability 1. We know that we sicken millions of people every year because they breathe too many particulates, and we know that we alter the Earth's climate through our CO2 emissions. Those are not good choices. It's not a good technology. And we should, so just because it's familiar to us doesn't mean we should be more tolerant of it than some other technology whose consequences are less thoroughly understood. Will we fix this? Will we manage to double agricultural output? It's not clear, right? We don't know. One thing that would help is if the markets for some of these agricultural inputs were less distorted, right? So water is a great example. Right? So we have been reluctant in this country to create anything like markets for water. Water's too important to be left with the marketplace, we assert. So to whom do we give authority? The government, whom we decide we don't trust in so many other arenas, basically has authority to allocate water resources. And that one consequence is that water is given to farmers in Northern California for, say, $20 an acre foot, which would be worth $7,000 an acre foot if you could pump it over the Tehachapi Mountains and down into the LA Basin for use in municipal and industrial processes. So we're leaving enormous gains from trade on the table because we think that because we don't trust the way these markets might work. And that, it turns out, since water is so fundamental to agriculture, that is perhaps one of the most important impediments to a solution to this food problem, which is quite significant. Okay, so pulling back the lens a little bit, I think I might take off this coat, it's hot. At least it's hot under these legs. Maybe you're comfortable. I want to talk about what we might think of when we say sustainable development. So sustainable development sounds like a good thing, right? How could you be against that? You want development because it sounds good, it sounds like progress. And you certainly don't want unsustainable development. That sounds catastrophe, right? So, but what does it mean actually? Like when a company says it's moving towards sustainability, what could they possibly mean? It seems like a completely empty phrase, right? In fact, I think it usually is a completely empty phrase. Usually when a company says we're pursuing sustainable development or we're moving in the direction of sustainability, what they mean is there's stuff that activists want us to do and the government doesn't yet require us to do. And we don't think the government's going to require us to do it, but we're not sure, and so we want to buy some insurance, and it's good PR. Right? Great. That's a good way to solve a significant social problem, if it is a significant social problem, right? So what might it mean? Remember back, almost 30 years ago, the United Nations wrote a report named after the chairperson of the commission who wrote it, whose name was Brundtland, who was the Prime Minister of Norway, I think, about sustainable development. And it said, sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Well, that sounds pretty reasonable, right? If you could figure out a way of measuring any of those quantities, that would be actually a pretty good formulation, I think, right? Now, it turns out that in the business world, people have been thinking about sustainability forever, right? Because when the shareholders of a company are presented with a dividend check, their first question is always, well, how did you generate these cash flows, right? Did you just sell the factory and now you're giving us the cash? That wouldn't be so good, right? Or did you use the factory to make something that people actually wanted to buy and sell the stuff at a profit and use part of the profits to reinvest in the factory and use part of the profits to give to us, the shareholders? That would be a totally different thing, right? So how do shareholders of firms ensure that they're getting this information? Well, they demand that the firm present it to them, right? And the most common way it gets presented is on some kind of balance sheet, right? So at the risk of offending the business professors in the room, the main financial accounts that companies present are the income statement, which is a view of the revenues and the costs in a particular year, and the balance sheet, which is a snapshot of the assets and the liabilities of the company at a given moment in time, usually on the last day of the fiscal year, right? So what does a company balance sheet might look like this? It has assets on one side, right? Has liabilities on the other, and equities. Right, the assets, what are the assets? Well, it probably has some cash. It probably has some accounts receivable, which are monies that are owed to it by customers who haven't paid their bills yet. It probably has some inventories of stuff, unless it's a service business. Maybe it has some property, plant, and equipment, and so on, right? So it has both liquid assets and illiquid ones. It probably also has some money that it owes to its creditors, so those would be called accounts payable, etc. And then if you subtract the liabilities from the assets, you get some number which is the book value of the equity of the firm, right? That's the net worth of the firm. So think about an oil company, for example. Much of the fixed assets of the oil company are just oil in the ground, right? So if the company drills the oil, converts it to cash, and then gives the cash out to shareholders, then over time, its net worth should be declining, right? And it's not a sustainable business. That could be okay, right? The shareholders might not want it to be a sustainable business. They might not want it to be reinvesting all those monies into looking for more oil if they don't think it has good geologists. And they certainly might not want it to invest them in solar cells or some other business that the oil executives might not know very much about. But if you were looking at a company, you might say a sustainable company is one that has non-declining net worth. Right? So maybe we should conduct the same experiment for economies, for macroeconomies, for nations. So let's make this a national balance sheet. What's the national balance sheet of the United States look like? Well, it's funny, isn't it? You'd think you'd know, right? Like we talk about GDP all the time. We talk about gross domestic product, right? That's the income statement. We obsess about that number. We think, oh, did it go up by 2%? Did it decline by 1%? You know, oh, they'll never win the next election if it went down by 2%. We never ask about the balance sheet. We never ask how the country is generating that income. But don't you think we should? Wouldn't that make sense? So think about the national balance sheet for a second. How would we, so suppose we had two companies and they merged, so then they have to consolidate their balance sheets, right? What would you do? You just add the assets and you add the liabilities and you cancel things. If one owed money to the other, then in the merger that particular thing would cancel out, right? So let's think about the national balance sheet. Well, the national balance sheet is just the consolidated balance sheets of all the entities within the nation, right? So I have a balance sheet, you have a balance sheet, the University of Montana has a balance sheet. We'll start with mine, it's easy because I'm an academic and I've never made that much money, right? So what do I have? I have a little cash, maybe. Let's not worry about the cash for the moment. I have a house. I maybe have some bonds, not Greek. Well, Greek bonds would be interesting. So let's say Greek bonds. Let's say I have some GE bonds, that is bonds issued by the General Electric Corporation, headquartered probably in Delaware, and I have some Greek bonds too, right? I told you I wasn't very smart about money. And do I have some liabilities? I probably have some liabilities, right? Say I have a mortgage. So that's about it for me. So then we have GE, right? GE has all kinds of stuff, right? They have all kinds of factories and machines and so on. They have a lot of real assets. The GE bonds to them are a liability, right? The bonds that they've issued, the borrowing that they've done, which have been purchased by people like me and you, are a liability to them. And then they have some equity number two, right? So we keep doing this addition, right? We pile balance sheet on balance sheet. And what's going to happen, it turns out that most of what's on most people's balance sheets is financial claims on other domestic actors, right? So you have a bank account. That's an asset to you, but it's a liability to your bank. So when we do the consolidation, those things cancel, right? Same with the GE bonds, right? They're an asset to me who holds them, but they're a liability to the firm who issues them. So those cancel. And so if we do all that, the mortgage is held by some bank. So that's an asset to them. So when we add them to this list, that cancels too, right? So what are we going to be left with? We're going to be left with a bunch of real assets like houses and factories and roads and oil wells, right? Oil in the ground, trees, rocks, etc. And Greek bonds, but also maybe some other more valuable assets held against foreigners, right? What's a Greek bond? It's a claim on the cash flows of the Greek state, right? That's why it's not very valuable. But you can imagine other investments in non-US assets that would be quite valuable, right? So you have, when we add all this up, what we're going to have is a bunch of real assets, including natural resources like oil and trees, and reproducible capital, so say roads, factories, schools, etc. And claims on the rest of the world, right? Because those aren't going to cancel. The liability there is in Germany or in Greece or in Japan or somewhere. So that doesn't cancel. On the other side, what are we going to have? We're going to have claims by the rest of the world. Like, for example, the treasury bonds that are being held by the People's Bank of China, right? That's not going to cancel here. So we have claims by the rest of the world. And basically nothing else except some national net worth number. And by the logic that we just talked about when we were doing the company, you'd think that that sustainable development would mean non-declining national net wealth, right? What would that mean? That would mean that if you were going to cut down trees or take oil out of the ground, it wouldn't say you can't do that and be sustainable. If it did, that would be a ridiculous injunction, right? We're not going to quit drilling oil wells, and we're not going to quit cutting down trees. What it says is that if you drill oil and so you can't produce from that particular field next year, you should replace that asset with some other asset that's equally valuable, right? Like factories or roads or something, or maybe educated people, right? There are no people on this balance sheet. And that's the big problem with this kind of accounting, right? Because if you add up all of the tangible assets, the natural resources and the roads and factories and so on, why do you care about these assets? You care about them because they're going to generate future income, right? That's what an asset is something that generates future income. But it turns out that then if you think about the income that we're currently producing, say in the United States, and you assume for a second that we're going to be able to produce something like that income for the next several years, you get a number for a total asset number that is substantially higher than the sum of all this other stuff. Like maybe a factor of several times higher. And the difference is what? The difference is the educated men and women whose know-how and skill allow them to combine these other assets in such a way as to generate income and generate wealth, right? So, but fortunately, people can't put other people's human capital on their balance sheets, right? It used to be that they could, right? But then we abolished those particular kinds of institutions. And we should all be happy that we did. But but if we think narrowly for a second about these real assets, then what this means, this has a couple of implications. One is that you can't really think about environmental problems having to do with sustainability without thinking about a much broader context involving savings and investment, right? And if we are to draw down our stocks of natural resources, whether those are oil or minerals or trees or even beautiful places in which we like to do recreation, we should be replacing those assets with other assets that will be equally valuable and equally productive. Right? Now there are all kinds of enormous valuation problems here, and people in various academies, especially Stanford, actually have made a lot of progress on those topics. We also haven't said too much so far here about externalities, but obviously should correct these values for any externalities that are involved, any non-price effects. And one other implication, I guess, is that if we are to go from a society which is mostly dependent on natural capital to a society that's mostly dependent on other kinds of capital, human capital formation, which is to say education, is absolutely critical. Right? So maybe this is just a way of confirming what you already knew, which is to say, it's not clear whether the path that we're currently on is sustainable or not. If we had better understanding of these quantities, we would have a better idea of whether it's sustainable. But the broad implications for our behavior of this analysis are ones that I think you will find quite intuitively appealing, right? That you shouldn't, if you're going to exploit natural resources, you should have some prospect of replacing the extractive activity with something else once the resources have been depleted. That human capital formation is absolutely central. Without investing in skilled people, in literacy, we can't expect to be prosperous in the long run, and that we can't separate the environmental savings or dissavings that we do from other forms of saving and dissaving. So it's possible to be pretty gloomy about that last thing, right? So are we saving enough? That's the question. Well, the fact is that since about 1980, we've been embarked on quite a massive savings program, we Americans nationally, right? So I think we see that in the environmental arena. I think we see that in the current unwillingness of many of the politicians in the country to confront the climate externality. You could say, well, that's just because people like to be subsidized, and it's hard to do away with subsidies. But in the education arena, too, I think we're doing a considerable amount of dissaving by failing to educate our young people to the degree that we should. And even at the most basic level, we know that we're dissaving, and you can see that in the balance of payments accounts, right? So balance of payments accounting, as you might know, just is a way of keeping track of the international transactions of the economy, so imports, exports, foreign direct investment, et cetera. And in particular, there's a number that doesn't get much attention in the United States called the current account, which is just the flows of values across borders for all current services and goods. Right? If you run a current account deficit, that is, if you consume more than you produce, then you have to make up that deficit by selling something. And what are you going to sell? Well, nothing current, right? Because by definition, the current account already includes all that stuff. So what else can you sell? Well, you can sell claims on the future cash flows of the American economy, right? And that is what we have done every year since 1980, right? The last time we ran a current account surplus in this country was I think in 1980, except for 1 year right after the first Gulf War when we got some unusual transfers of capital from Germany and Japan. But in every other year since 1980, we have consumed more than we have produced. We have invested, that is to say we've invested more than we've saved, which is to say we have relied on foreign savers to make our accounts balance. And what that means, if we're selling claims on net on the future cash flows of the American economy year after year after year, we're going to have a net international investment position which is going down, right? So think of all the stuff, all the assets that Americans own abroad, and subtract from that number all the stuff that non-Americans own in the United States. In 1980, that number for the United States was the biggest number that it had ever been for any nation in the history of the world. That is, the United States was the world's biggest creditor nation in the history of the earth, right? And where are we now? We're now the world's biggest debtor nation in history. This has occurred almost unremarked upon. Right? You don't hear very much about this in Washington, D.C. It's astonishing that you don't. Is it consequential? We have no idea. We really don't know. But we have gone from a situation where on net, every American owned several $1,000s more of foreign assets than foreigners owned here, to a situation where that per capita number is minus $10,000. Does it matter? We honestly don't know, but it's certainly a form of dissaving, right? And if you pile that on the other kinds of dissaving that we've done in the environmental arena, in the educational arena, it's easy to be gloomy about the future. But I don't want to end this on such a gloomy note. And it's not just because I want to pretend to be cheerful. I do think that the outcomes are indeterminate, and I don't think that all of the tea leaves are unfavorable. You could think of focusing on the environment for a second, but I think the same thing applies to other kinds of dissaving. This country, the history of Europeans and Asians on the North American continent, has been a history of profligacy followed by crisis, followed by the creation of new kinds of private property rights, followed by renewed prosperity. So, for example, sometimes those new property rights have not come in time to save the natural asset that they were designed to protect, right? So for example, here's another gloomy one, and then I'm done with the gloomy ones. If you think about the cod fishery off the shores of my now home state of Massachusetts and Nova Scotia and so on, when Europeans first came to those waters, they were just flabbergasted at the density of the codfish populations there. You could almost literally walk across the water on the backs of the fish. And so what did they do? They did what you would expect. They fished them as hard as they possibly could. And for centuries, they had no discernible effect on the populations. The population seemed to be stable. Then in about the 1970s, the population suddenly fell off the table, and it has never since recovered. And why is that? Well, you can think of all kinds of explanations having to do with better technology on the boats, or more efficient harvesting, or more demand as more people got wealthy enough to demand fish, and so on. But I think the fundamental problem was that there was no property rights regime for fish in the ocean. The only way you could assert property rights to a fish was to pull it out of the water and hit it on the head. Then it was yours. And so, of course, under those circumstances, people overexploited the resource, right? And unfortunately, because of cod population dynamics, by the time we figured out that what we needed was a regime that provided private property rights for fish in the sea, it was apparently too late for the cod. But we have now created private property regimes for other species in Atlantic and Pacific waters, called tradable catch permits or something like that, that basically make the private entrepreneurs realize the scarcity of the resource while it's still in the ocean, right? And those have, by and large, protected the populations. I think the same roughly is true of trees. And I'm reluctant to talk about trees in Montana, since I know that at least 2/3 of the people in this room know more about this topic than I do. But my understanding as a Harvard person is that about 100 years ago, Theodore Roosevelt, himself a Harvard man, and Gifford Pinchot, who actually went to Yale, realized that that a timber famine was coming, right? That the responsible scientific opinion was that we were running out of timber as a nation. And the reason was that trees weren't being planted, basically. Not enough timber was being planted, too many trees were being cut down, the stocks were declining, people projected and they said, oh, in another 20 years we'll be out of timber, and then what will we build our houses with? So Roosevelt and Pinchot created this system of national forests, and they started enforcing rules against trespass on the national forest. So you couldn't just walk onto the public lands and cut down whatever tree you wanted anymore. And that created incentive for private entrepreneurs to start planting trees, with the result that 100 years later, there's more forest cover in the United States than there was at the time of Roosevelt and Pinchot. So it's, if the government creates property rights systems that will send signals about scarcity to private entrepreneurs, then the private entrepreneurs will behave in the proper way. Right? That's why I don't think peak oil is a problem, because property rights in the oil patch are relatively well enforced. Right? The sort of common property pools of oil, famous from Texas and Pennsylvania, are by and large gone. For the most part, oil in the ground has an owner, and that owner has an incentive to use it properly. Now, owners of scallop permits in Atlantic Canada have the incentive to manage those resources properly. It's not true yet of water, and it's not true yet of carbon dioxide, which is why I'm more worried about water problems and way more worried about climate change than I am about something like peak oil, where the property rights are better enforced. So I've been thinking about these topics for some years, and when I came to this, what I thought was an insight about property rights and their evolution as scarcity increases, I was pretty proud of myself. And then a couple years, maybe a few months later, I happened to be reading an old book that I actually got from my mother. And I brought the book here, I think. And I discovered that the ideas that I'd been so proud of were not mine at all, which maybe won't surprise you. But it turned out that this fellow wrote in 1967, I think, something very close to what I just told you. Really, although we speak of water as a valuable resource, we don't treat it that way. Scarcely any American pays for water. It's still a free good. Land once was also free, but as we have increased in numbers, we have become accustomed to paying for it. Timber was once free, but now we are accustomed to paying for the right to cut it. Water is still free, but perhaps as we become more crowded and more demanding, it too will have a value and will cease to be a free good. In another essay, written actually a couple years earlier in the 60s, the same person wrote, "As a general principle, when pressure on the environment grows, property rights intensify and new property rights tend to appear." So you can imagine, so I laboriously crawl toward these conclusions myself, I think independently, and then I realized that other people have thought of them before. In particular, this one man, whose name is Dan Luton, who many of you knew, right? And it turns out, when I was in the early 80s, I actually got to spend quite a bit of time with Professor Luton, who taught at the University of California at Berkeley, but used to spend summers in Missoula. And I don't remember ever talking to him about this particular problem of property rights applied to natural resources. I talked to him about all kinds of things, and I would be very surprised if in one of those conversations this idea had not been planted in my mind 20 years before I so proudly thought that I thought of it myself. Right? I think that's the way. I think that's a general point about the way the mind works, actually. But so when I discovered these passages in this book of Luton's, I was really excited, and I would have loved to have called him and talked to him about them and learned more from him. And I could not do that because he's no longer alive. And I don't think we should mourn over much. He had a long life and a very productive one, and he had a good death, and I think that his teaching of us while he was here and his willingness to leave a legacy in his books have enriched us enormously. So I'm grateful for the time I got to spend with him, and I'm grateful that he left this book. But I also personally am regretful that I didn't spend more time later in the 80s and in the 90s when he was alive learning more from him. So if I have a takeaway from this lecture, I know that takeaways are popular in academic culture these days. My takeaway doesn't have anything to do with natural resources or anything to do with the environment or anything to do with lessons from business strategy. It's a much simpler and much broader thing, which is if we think that there is somebody from whom we can learn something, we ought to try to start that learning process today, because the fact is we don't really know how much time we will have to do that learning. With that, I don't know how much over my time I have gone, but I imagine Professor Daly wants to help me take a few questions and then we'll get on our way. So thank you for your time and attention. Thank you. I'm going to have some water. Excuse me.
I said the lecture would be informative and stimulating. I should have said it would be thought-provoking, which indeed it was. We have time for a few questions, which Professor Reinhardt has agreed to answer. What I'm going to ask is that if you do have a question, please use the microphone. When you get to the microphone, identify yourself, and please make it a succinct question with a question mark rather than a comment. I have a hard time seeing you.
You only have one. You don't have any choice.
You've talked about the need to have externalities reflected in the price of energy. What specifically do you think we should be doing, and what are the prospects that we'll be able to do it about global climate change?
Well, so Ed Markey's my congressman back home in Belmont, Massachusetts. And I think he's one of the smartest men in the House, and I think that was a good piece of legislation, and I wish that the Senate had passed it, because Obama would have signed it. What are the prospects now? The prospects now depend to a large degree on what happens in November. I'm not especially optimistic. I don't think that we will have a carbon price in the United States in the next few years, but I would be delighted to be surprised. I know there's a big discussion about whether it's better to have a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. I would be happy with either, frankly. I think the differences between them are relatively small. I think a cap and trade system has a better chance of being passed. I think that the Republican assertion that cap and trade is nothing but the equivalent of a tax is exactly right, and I think that's why it's valuable, right? It's just like with a cap and trade system, you set the quantity of pollution and the market gives you a price. With a tax, you set the price and the market gives you a quantity. But it's the same supply curve, right? And they both have the same incentive effects, and so I think they are both equally valuable. I think that's the thing that we would most like to see, that I would most like to see happen. In its absence, I think that in the absence of a carbon tax or a carbon price, the best you can do is subsidize the alternatives, but that seems like a very inferior solution to me. I mean, basically what I've said is that we subsidized our way into this energy problem by subsidizing consumption. You have to be pretty heroic to assert that the solution is to subsidize other kinds of energy technologies to level the playing field. That's a hard sell, I think.
Hi, sorry. I just had a question. So you talked a little bit about GMOs and especially Monsanto. What or how do you think we could allow Monsanto to still do the kind of good work that they do with GMOs and with increasing land productivity without doing the kind of harmful effects that they are right now with both the farmers they work with and also the environments that they are around?
So I'm not sure what environmental consequences you have in mind. I haven't seen scientific information that leads me to be especially concerned about the pure ecological effects of these technologies. The question about the Monsanto relationship with the farmers is a question about the distribution of the economic surplus, right? And the farmers think that Monsanto is capturing too much of the gains, the economic gains created by this technology. But Monsanto did invent the technology, and it does hold patents. And its enforcement of its intellectual property rights is actually a relatively straightforward matter in law, right, as far as I understand. So they have been heavy-handed about it, I think, and they have not had the best public relations imaginable. But I think that the base... What did I do? How did I do that? Oh. Somebody wants us to leave. So I think that the basic argument that in order to create incentives to develop these technologies, which are comparable in development times and development costs to the most advanced pharmauticals, you have to provide some kind of protection for the intellectual property. I think that's a pretty reasonable one. I mean, it's one that people seem to be pretty comfortable with drug companies and even with record companies.
Thank you.
You mentioned that when we use natural resources, we should be replacing that with human capital. As I've been around for a while now, I've noticed that every single year, legislatures and governments cut funding for education. Mm-hmm. Do you think this country still values education enough to make the investment necessary to replace the natural resources with human capital?
I think that this country needs to value its educational system to a greater degree than it does. And I think that the basic problems, we still have the best higher education in the world by far, right? The American universities are still streets ahead of the European and Asian ones. Where I think we're doing ourselves a disservice is in basic education for young children, especially at the lower end of the income distribution. This problem relates to the skewing of income, which has taken place all during the same period since the 1980s. The Gini coefficient, which is the measure of income distribution, has showed more and more skewedness since about the same time as we started embarking on this program of current account deficits and dis-saving. So I think that is a topic about which optimism requires quite some faith, I would say. I wish I had a better answer for you.
Thank you for coming and speaking with us tonight. My question is, how will or what will make the current account deficit change to become a surplus if, we're the wealthiest nation in the world and we can afford to purchase these inexpensive, cheap goods made overseas, and we can only sell our expensive goods to what countries? What are we selling? What can we sell?
We sell all kinds of stuff, and we'll sell more. We would sell more stuff if the dollar fell in value against the currencies of the major trading partners. And I mean, that's one of the reasons that the Greek thing is so consequential, right? Because it's weakening the euro. But the normal way for current account deficits to balance themselves is through changes in the currencies, right? Because if the dollar declines in value against the Japanese or the Chinese currency, then American exports to China will look cheaper to Chinese people, and Chinese exports to the United States will look more expensive to Americans. And so the problem is complicated in the particular case of the United States by the fact that the dollar is still the world's reserve currency. And so, as you remember, in 2008, when there was this huge financial panic triggered by events that had taken place in America, the dollar rose in value, right, which is not what you ordinarily expect from the source of a crisis of that sort. So I think that the American reputation as being a safe haven so far has prevented the currency from falling to the degree that the current account balance would become a surplus. But I don't think that will last forever.
We have time for one more question.
Sorry about that. Yeah, you mentioned the need for regulation and water rights and property rights with water. Recently there's been some small conflicts dealing with that, just like with people collecting rainwater and stuff.
With people what, I'm sorry?
Collecting rainwater above their houses. And there have been some small claims court issues that have been dealing with this in Colorado and stuff, I know. How big of a conflict do you think is going to be, or how many conflicts, or how big of a conflict do you think is going to be needed to actually bring this issue to the table?
That's a great question. You'd think that the gains from trade already would be big enough to lead us to create markets for these water rights. So I mean, just to put the numbers in context, the municipal and household uses are relatively small, right? It's mostly agricultural and environmental uses that matter. And so if you can have even a market mechanism that allows farmers to trade with one another, that would already be a huge improvement. And the problem, I think, is like the problem with CO2, that people like to talk about markets, but when push comes to shove, they often seem to prefer their own current subsidized consumption levels to a transparent system of property rights that would reward innovation and reward efficiency, even though it seems like it ought to be hard to be against such a system.
Thank you, Professor Reinhart, for your remarks.
Can I just say one other thing?
Go ahead.
I just want to say again, thank you for joining me this evening, and thank you to the university and the Goose family for the invitation to come back to Missoula. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great.